Hi, I'm Howie, and I'm here to give you the briefest possible introduction to Scrum. Well, what exactly is Scrum? A technical definition might be that it's a complex and adaptive framework which helps you deal with really chunky problems in life. Many of you might be thinking, is Scrum Agile? Are they the same thing? Well, the way I like to think about it is Scrum helps you on your journey towards destination Agile. And therefore it's really useful to understand exactly what Agile is first. So, how does Agile work? How does Agile work with big products, big problems, big projects if you like? Well, broadly, it takes those really big, chunky, difficult problems and says, hey, they're going to be really hard to manage in one big lump. So let's slice them up. Let's slice the problem up. And let's take a small chunk of one of those problems and build some product to try and actually make a solution. And then what we'll do really simply is, once we built that tiny little chunk of product, we'll say, hey, did it fix our problem? Was it actually a solution? Or no, that was terrible, it didn't do what we needed at all. And based on that, it'll give us feedback about how should we approach the problem in future. So that's agility in a nutshell. It's incremental and iterative product development, but it's also building in a lot of learning. Scrum is one framework to help you with that journey. So one of the things that Scrum adds in straight off the bat, for example, is an idea of someone to help you prioritize which of these little mini problems you should focus on first. And Scrum gives us a really clear role to help us make those decisions. And we call that role the product owner. Product owner represents a broad range of stakeholders, but especially users, people that are really interested in changing the world in a small way. So a lot of their job is about liaising with these stakeholders and various users. Stakeholders are wearing top hats, right? Because they often have a lot of money. And once they've had these conversations, they can create a list of all of these problems or potentially opportunities which we might want to consider to actually fix or build. And we store this list in our first item, which we're going to discuss in Scrum, called a product backlog. Now, our product backlog is made up of anything which we deem to be a valuable possible solution to one of these products, or anything else which we think is going to move our experiments along. And it's ordered by a whole variety of things. So we might consider value, how much effort it's going to take to build, risk, any time-bound dependencies, speed to market, cost of delay, loads of factors. But ultimately it ends up being one prioritized list of problems to solve. And each one of these small items within the product backlog we call a product backlog item. But many of you may be very familiar with user stories, for example. But canonically for Scrum, it's product backlog item. Yeah. Now, this isn't a fixed requirements list like some of you might be familiar with. There's no long change requests here. It evolves continuously, as you can imagine, because as we build a little piece and find out some feedback from it, we're going to adjust this. So typically the kind of stuff that can happen, for example, is users go, hey, do you know what? Could it build this as well? That would be really useful to us. And we might add that into the product backlog, say, here. Notice it doesn't go in first and it doesn't go in last. It's continuously prioritized. It's a very organic document, if you like. But we might also find out, do you know what? When you built product backlog item A, it was kind of funky, we didn't like it that much, and so the product owner goes, hey, that's really interesting, because we've got another feature very similar to that, another problem we're going to solve for you, that's further down in the backlog. Should we bother building that, or should we replace it with more valuable activities? And so we might actually delete stuff, throw it in the trash, okay? Also, we might be reordering items, and because this backlog isn't fully detailed up front, we allow the detail to emerge. Part of what we're going to have to do as well is break big chunky items like this one here into much smaller chunks. Things which are easier to understand. Smaller chunks of the original problem as we discussed earlier. Now, once we've got a decent product backlog, we can actually think about going into what we call a sprint. Yeah. And a sprint is a Scrum term for a time box, typically of less than a month. Though many teams run sort of 2-week sprints, I've got teams running 2, 3-week sprints, 1-week sprints. Buddy of mine called Ian, he has 1-day sprints. He'll tell you about those. I find them challenging, but they work really well for him and his teams. And the goal of each of those sprints is to build a little bit of a solution to this problem, to build a little bit of product. Yeah. Obviously, it's not going to be the entire thing, because as we discussed, that's big and difficult, chunky for us to manage. So we call each of these little products that we make in sprint an increment. And our sprint is just an iterative way of making these products in an incremental way. So as I said, typically less than a month. So who's going to be building this product? Well, our product owner is giving us input on what to build, but who's actually making it? Who's actually designing it for us? Well, I wanted to introduce you, therefore, to our second Scrum role, and this is called the development team, the people doing the work. Now, at this point, I think it's really important to point out that these days, Scrum and indeed Agile is being used to manage products from a really wide range of work, not just software development. So that term, development team, might be a bit misleading. It's actually a cross-functional team. And what I mean by that is they've got all the skills they need to get the work done. So if you were a traditional software team, you might be looking at things like analysis skills, coding skills, testing skills, UX experience. But I've done work with all kinds of weird teams, that aren't traditional. Marketing teams, for example. I've got friends who are working on policy creation using Scrum. So therefore the mix of skills is going to be quite different. Regardless though of the kind of domain you're working in, there are some really sort of common qualities of this team. And one of them is that we keep the team fairly small. Why small? Well, it makes decision making easier, it builds trust, all this kind of good stuff. And by small, I mean typically 6 ± 3. Most teams I work with, you're talking around about sort of 4 or 5, but I do have teams right up to the maximum of that. We also keep this team stable. Yeah, we keep them working together for long periods of time. The reason being is that helps them work out how they're going to work together, it makes them more predictable, and again, builds trust and good team rapport. We also give them really relentless focus. Partially that's done by them working on a single product backlog. So they know this is our big chunky problem to solve, and solve little bits of it, so they're gaining really specific knowledge about this. But also we're really sort of enforcing that focus by making each of these sprints pretty short. Yeah? So there's always a kind of a deadline looming, if you like. Helps us really think, hey, are we doing the right thing today to solve that problem? Because we haven't got many days left in this sprint to solve the problems we've chosen to do. So obviously for each sprint, we need to work out how we're going to get from this big list of product backlog items to a smaller achievable list that can be done in one sprint. And we call this event for managing this sprint planning. So you can see it as like a gateway from the product backlog into the sprint. Now in sprint planning, it's kind of a 2-stage event. Product owner comes with a really nicely prioritized product backlog and says, hey, these are the biggest, most valuable problems for me to solve. And the development team turn up, I often say, like a little shopping basket. And they say, hey, that's great. This is kind of the amount of stuff we can solve based on typically past experience. How much can we get done in 2 weeks, say? Well, last time we managed to solve kind of 11 big problems. So we can maybe solve 11 of these little problems as well. That's not a real problem for us. So 2 parts, the what, based on how much we can do, but also what's most important. But then they also work out how they're going to achieve it. The development team will take those problems and analyze them in far more detail, often creating technical tasks and little stages along the way, so that they can actually manage that work, plan that work. And that's the second part of sprint planning. This is the how. So always think sprint planning, what, and then how. At the end of sprint planning, we end up with what we call a sprint backlog, which makes sense. It's a smaller backlog that's focused just on the sprint. This isn't just a planning document, this is also going to act as an inspect and adapt document as we move through the sprint. Hey, this is where we thought we'd be, what stage are we done? Well, actually, yeah, this is being done now, and actually we finished this one, and that means we feel like we're kind of on track for a team that's maybe partway through the sprint, for example. So it's another living, breathing document, and you'll find this very common with a lot of the artifacts in Scrum, is that they continually update to reflect the change in the reality of the situation. So how do we go from this sprint backlog through to a new product increment, which will be made up of multiple product backlog items? Well, this is where the sprint comes into play. So although sprint planning itself is also part of the sprint, there's a lot of other events contained within this sort of 2-week typical length sprint that help us get to here. And one of the key ones, one of the ones I see done most badly in the wild actually, is what we call our daily scrums, which happen daily as the name suggests. Teams typically focus on them as kind of a reporting mechanism, and it misses the key point about what these events are about. And the way I always sort of coach people about them is they're there to inspect and adapt to make the best possible plan for the day. What's the best thing we can do as a team to move as many of these items as possible closer to being complete and ready to be included in the next product increment? Many teams, you'll see them using the 3 key questions. You may have come across these. What have I done since the last daily scrum? What am I planning on today? And what risks, issues, or blockers do I currently face? And those can be helpful, but ultimately the goal is to end up with a new plan for the day. How are we going to get as much of this done as possible? Once we have started to move towards our increment, we often find we have problems within teams. And this is even worse when you're scaling, when you have teams of teams. And that's that the quality of the product backlog items flowing through the system tends to get diluted and confused. And that makes it really difficult to inspect the new increment. So Scrum gives us a really handy little tool to help us get more clarity about the quality of all the items which are making up this increment. And we call this a definition of done. It is possibly one of the singly most useful things I find about Scrum. It's applicable to so many different areas. And what we're trying to do is just be really clear about what we mean when we say an item is finished. No more of this, it's done, but I haven't tested it, or actually it's pretty much complete, but we haven't done the documentation that we promised. So any sort of quality factors, any kind of additional work that we're meant to be doing, that's going to get notated down in the definition of done, and it creates like a global quality check for all our items flowing into the increment, which gives us a much more greater understanding when we actually come to inspect it. And talking of inspection, this brings us on quite nicely to our next key Scrum event, which is the sprint review. Now, the sprint review is all about this product, and it's our key inspect and adapt of the increment. And it's a really broad event. Our product owners there, our development teams there, our whole Scrum teams there, including the Scrum Master, we're going to talk about more later. But most importantly, there's a really wide range of stakeholders and users. Because after all, these are the guys that asked for stuff in the first place. So it's flowing for our product backlog, in the sprint backlog, we've built it, here's your new increment, here's the new list of problems we've solved, do you like them? And so, I often hear this called a show and tell, and again, it's missing the key point of it. The point here is to actually inspect this and make us smarter, make us more likely to build a better thing the next time. This is going right back to our idea of agility and how this should work, learning every time we make a new increment. So really important that when you're doing these sprint reviews, you are always thinking that it's an inspect and adapt event. I once went to a company and they were like, hey, I was like, why are you so quiet in your sprint reviews? And they were told, it's show and tell. So, we've been shown and we've been told. No, we need their feedback. Once we've got some feedback on the product itself, it's time to do what I think is one of the most important events in Scrum, and one that's most rapidly dropped, to be honest. And that's our sprint retrospective. So sprint retrospectives are all about our process rather than about our product. And that means we're thinking, how have we worked as a team? what did we get right? What did we do wrong? What are we going to stop, start, continue? How can we be better next time around? And for me, it's a key part of agility, let alone Scrum, because if you're not doing this, then all you really are is iterative and incremental. You're not building in any learning cycles, which means you're not going to see the kind of drastic improvements that we're hoping we'll witness within Scrum teams and Agile teams. So retrospective, because of the nature of it, is a much quieter, more closed meeting. Broadly, we invite the key Scrum team members, so the development team, the product owner, and our Scrum Master, who we'll introduce you to in a minute, so that we can actually really focus on the problem and how we'll open this, we'll trust, and really get to the grit of how we can be better. So they're very different types of events, and they focus on very different areas, but both are vital for helping you improve both your product and your process so that each iteration around gets smarter and gets better. So to help the team keep on track, many of the teams themselves actually keep some really simple metrics, if you like, broadly tracking, hey, we thought within sprint we were going to get 10 or 12 items done, and we're halfway through, and if that was 12 items and that's the end of sprint, then it looks at the moment like we're doing quite, maybe not as great as we thought. We're tracking that through, we might be a little bit shortfall. These are burn down charts. Some teams use them, some teams don't. Some just rely really heavily on their sprint backlog to give them this information. Others get even more technical and use things like cumulative flow diagrams. But broadly, the team's always got the ability to look at the amount of work that's remaining in sprint, project forward and go, hey, yeah, I think we're on track, or no, actually, we probably need to get together as a whole team with our product owner and start thinking about reprioritizing what's within the sprint so we get the most valuable stuff done out of what we originally forecast to get completed. Similarly, the product owner might also be keeping a longer term graph or some metrics, thinking, hey, based on how much work my team's completing, I can look forward and say, hey, this team's going to need, 10 or 12 sprints to complete the entire of the big problem, the entirety of our product backlog. So there is measurement within Scrum, there is some control, which is something where many people kind of forget that. They think it's complete free-fall. In fact, we often say Scrum is an empirical method. We are using past data to help us look to the future and give us some input about where we might end up being. So here's a problem though. In our first sprint, imagine the team took all these nice little product backlog items that were really well understood, really well refined, munched it all, completed it all through the sprint. They pulled some into sprint backlog, and then it made up large parts of our increment with all this nice, shiny, small little product backlog items. They do a sprint review, users give us some feedback, we learn about the process. Wonderful. But we're now coming to our second sprint. And as you can see, what's left is bigger, chunkier, less well refined, less well detailed. Well, the product backlog is meant to be emergent. So we don't want all the detail up front. Over time, we will need to add more and more detail to it. And this happens in parallel with actually completing work. It's not technically an event in Scrum, we call it an activity. The best advice I can give you is make sure you do it, and do it little and often. And this is where we're slicing big product backlog items down into smaller ones, we're adding more detail, potential acceptance criteria, so that when we come round to the next sprint planning event, we've got better product backlog, better refined, better detailed, nicer, smaller slices, just like we had before. So this obviously represents quite a shift for many organizations. So how do we ensure that we're enacting these events, that people understand why they're useful and valuable, that we have the right roles in place, such as the product owner? Well, that's where one of our final Scrum role comes into play, and that's our Scrum Master. And our Scrum Master is someone that kind of really lives the values of Scrum, something we haven't introduced yet. But some of them, we've touched on very lightly. So they're values such as focus, one we've already mentioned, but also courage, because this is going to be a new system. that's going to take courage to change. Also, we're making experiments. Sometimes they fail. We need to embed those experiments and say, hey, there's learning from this. Even if it didn't solve the problem, we've learned one way of not actually building this solution. So commitment as well. We've talked a bit about how we work on the most valuable stuff and that we commit to stuff within a sprint. So we go, hey, yeah, this is what we think we can get done. And the business agrees with that. It's like a joint commitment to what's the most important stuff to work on. But also openness. Imagine a sprint retrospective where people weren't willing to share opinions and talk to each other about stuff. It'd be completely useless. And then finally, also respect. We're bringing together typically business people with engineers, technical people, software developers much more tightly than has traditionally been managed. We're bringing different perspectives. That might mean we occasionally get disagreements. That's great. That's how we become creative. But we need to respect each other's opinion while still getting value from it. Similarly, even within one development team, we often have people from very different areas now. This is the cross-functional team. So we need to respect that diversity because it's actually really, really important to us. So Scrum Masters know Scrum, but also for me, equally if not more importantly, they also understand agility because ultimately that's the goal of Scrum, is to be agile, which means we can then create product iteratively, incrementally, while embedding learning. They're teaching people about perhaps, the value of sprint planning. Why do we do it? Why is it important? What's the proposed outcome of it? They're educating the business about why the right kind of product owner is really important for us. We need someone passionate and who's capable of making good decisions. Otherwise, the output's going to be pretty shoddy. So typically, they float around a bit. I can't really draw them sitting next to the development team or sitting with a product owner or with stakeholders because they go where there's the most point of friction. If you imagine that this sprint cycle is like the engine of creating product, then you can see the Scrum Master almost like an engineer. Yeah, they're keeping the system oiled. They're looking for where there's friction, where there's little bits of smoke coming up. And getting there and sorting it or enabling others to fix that problem, that impediment as quickly as possible so that we can keep churning out product and that we can keep learning. And that's also equally as important for us. So that's broadly Scrum. Right, we've got the three key roles, the product owner, the Scrum Master, and development team. We've talked about our events such as sprint planning and review, retrospective, and the daily Scrum. We've got a key transparency document, if you want a really geeky term, which is our definition of done, and some artifacts such as product backlog, the product backlog items, the sprint backlog, and our actual increment. It's lightweight, it's a framework, it's meant to be. It's meant to, you can add bits that you need to it, but it's the lightest you need to start moving on your Agile journey today. If you want more help on this, you can always reach out to us at Quanta. Thank you for listening.